I've always loved Wednesdays. It was the day Evie and I went to the pool after work, a little ritual we'd started 5 years ago when the doctor recommended swimming for her back. I remember how shy she was at first about her red slip-on swimsuit, but now she professionally struts across the water surface like a mermaid. Every Wednesday I would watch her gracefully glide from one side to the other and think about how lucky I was. But this Wednesday was going to be different. I sensed it the morning before, when Pierce Whitaker, my boss, called me into his office, not at the end of the day as usual, but at 9 o'clock sharp. His office smelled of coffee and lemon remedy. Our cleaning lady, Mrs. Chen, always wiped his desk with a special compound. I'd known that smell for 12 years, as long as I'd worked at Continental Transportation. "Have a seat, Brighton." Pierce pointed to the leather chair across from his desk. His voice sounded unaccustomedly formal. We hadn't become close friends over the years, but we'd always socialized quite warmly. He'd come to my birthday party 2 years ago, when Evie threw a surprise party at our house. I still have the vintage model truck he gave me as a gift. Collecting miniature replicas of transportation has been a long-time hobby of mine. "The company is going through a restructuring," he began, looking somewhere over my head. "We're being forced to optimize our staff." The next 15 minutes merged into one long hum for me. Downsizing, severance pay, letters of recommendation. I stared at the corner of the paper on his desk swaying in the draft and thought about Evie making French toast this morning. She was humming something from Billy Joel, her favorite singer, and I was hugging her from behind, snuggling my nose into her vanilla-scented hair. "Brighton?" Pierce's voice brought me back to reality. "Can you hear me?" "Yes, of course." I tried to smile. "When do I have to clear the desk?" "By the end of the week. Sorry, kid." I walked out of his office feeling like a ghost. My logistics department was on the 3rd floor, 127 stairs. I always counted them when walking up. It was another habit to avoid the elevator. "Gotta keep fit," I used to say, though really I was just afraid of confined spaces after that incident as a kid when I got stuck between floors for 3 whole hours. My team was already in place, 6 people I knew like the back of my hand. Laura, just back from maternity leave, Marcus with his collection of funny ties, Jim, the perpetual energy drinker. They didn't know yet. I wonder who'll be appointed in my place. The day dragged on endlessly. I mechanically answered emails, held a meeting on the quarterly report, even joked with colleagues during lunch. But there was an emptiness inside. How to tell Evie? For the past 3 months, she had been working hard at her private school, preparing some important project. I didn't want to add to her problems. At 4 in the afternoon, I texted her, "No pool today? Need to talk." The reply came almost immediately. "Sorry, honey. The meeting with my parents is going to run long. Can we talk at home?" She'd never missed our swims before. It was our tradition, an hour in the water, then dinner at a small Italian restaurant called Giovanni's, where we were already known by name and always had a table by the window. I went home earlier than usual. Our 2-story house in the suburbs greeted me with silence. I mechanically checked the mailbox, bills, advertisements, a gardening magazine for Evie. She'd gotten into growing roses last spring, and now our backyard resembled a little Versailles. The house smelled like cinnamon. Evie had baked an apple pie yesterday. I made my way to the kitchen and pulled a beer out of the fridge. On the magnetic board hung her class schedule, a shopping list, and a picture of our vacation in Maui 3 years ago, before she'd even gotten a job at this prestigious school. I turned on my laptop, deciding to look at job openings. The sooner I started my search, the better. Evie sometimes used my computer when her own was acting up. Opening the browser, I noticed that she had forgotten to log out of her email. I don't know what made me scroll down the page. Maybe the title of the email, "Meeting Cancelled?" with 3 question marks. Maybe the sender's name was Theodore Rutledge, vaguely familiar from her stories about school. I never read her correspondence. We trusted each other. We had no secrets. At least that's what I'd thought all those 8 years of marriage. "Dear Evie, I miss you every minute." My throat was instantly dry, and the can of beer in my hand was suddenly incredibly heavy. The front door slammed downstairs. Evie always came back through the back gate to check on her roses. "Honey, are you home?" Her voice, so familiar, echoed through the house. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. The day that had started with the layoff wasn't over yet, and I had no idea what its end would bring. Evie was saying something about a parent-teacher conference, about new educational programs, about how her students were preparing for some kind of competition. I nodded, but the words passed by my ears. I watched her cut the lettuce with careful, deliberate movements, not at all like the early years of our marriage, when the kitchen became a battleground after each of her culinary experiments. Brighton? Are you even listening to me? Evie put the knife aside and looked at me. Her red hair glinted copper in the kitchen light. She'd gathered it into a careless bun, like she always did when she cooked, and a few strands poked out, framing her face. Sorry, darling. Tough day at work. I took a sip of wine, the third one of the evening. I got fired. A salad knife clinked against the cutting board. Evie froze, her shoulders tensing under the thin fabric of her home t-shirt, my old Continental Transportation logo t-shirt that she'd picked up years ago. What? How did that happen? I told her. About this morning's meeting with Pierce, about the restructuring, about the 3 days to clear the desk. Evie listened, leaning against the kitchen counter, and I noticed her fingers nervously rubbing her wedding ring, an old habit that appeared in moments of stress. It's going to be okay, she finally said, walking over to me. You've got great experience, great references. You'll find something better. Her hand rested on my shoulder, such a familiar gesture of support. Yeah, sure, I smiled. Already started looking at job openings. Used your computer, by the way. Mine's acting up. Oh, really? So did you find anything interesting? I'm still looking. Hey, who's Theodore Rutledge? Shit! Evie snagged a wine glass standing nearby on the table. Dark red droplets scattered across the tiled floor like blood spatter. She quickly rummaged for a towel. I'm sorry, I'm so clumsy. Ted, he's a parent of one of my students. A member of the school's board of trustees. Why? Her voice sounded almost normal. Almost. If I hadn't lived with her for 8 years. If I didn't know every intonation. Oh, nothing. Saw an email from him in your mail. You forgot to log out of your account. Evie froze, leaning over a puddle on the floor. Did you read my mail? No, I lied. Just noticed the name. It seemed familiar. She straightened up, crumpling the wine-damp towel in her hands. For a second, I thought she was going to tell me everything. But Evie only shook her head. He's just very active in school life. His daughter, Lily, is in my class. Talented girl. I watched her wipe the floor and remembered the lines from that letter. Miss you every minute. How many were there, those letters? When did it all start? Maybe then, 6 months ago, when she'd suddenly decided to change her old cell phone for a new one. Or earlier. Finished cleaning up, she almost ran out of the kitchen. I heard her coming up the stairs. The third step creaked, as it always did. We were going to fix it last summer, but we never got around to it. There were always more important things to do. Left alone, I pulled out my cell phone. Theodore Rutledge. A search turned up several articles in the local press. A successful real estate developer, philanthropist, and sponsor of several educational programs. In the photo, a tall man of about 45, impeccable suit, confident smile. Next to him is a beautiful woman, Audrey Rutledge, his wife, also a member of the school's board of trustees. She stood in the kitchen doorway, and something in her posture reminded me of the day her mother died. The same tense straight back, the same clasped hands in front of her. Only then I'd hugged her, stroked her hair, whispered words of comfort. Now there was an entire kitchen between us, stained with red wine. You know what? She suddenly said. Let's go to the pool tomorrow. You missed today and we could both use some relaxation. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 9 p.m. She was usually checking her students' homework at that time, ensconced with her laptop in our little library. I used to join her often, reading a book or just sitting next to her, listening to her mumble something to herself as she corrected mistakes. Sure, I replied. That would be great. Evie smiled, the same smile I'd fallen in love with 9 years ago. But now I could see the corners of her lips twitching. I'm going to go do some work then. Lots of tests to check for tomorrow. She walked away, leaving the unfinished lettuce on the cutting board. This had never happened before. Evie always finished what she started, whether it was cooking or checking papers. I looked at the remaining vegetables, picked up the knife, chopped the tomatoes, too coarsely, not as neatly as she did, added olive oil and salt. I ate dinner alone, for the first time in a long time. Evie sent a text. Sorry, lots of work. We'll eat later. I stared at my phone screen, remembering all her delays at work over the past months, all the canceled plans, all the emergency meetings. How could I have been so blind? Before going to bed, I opened her email again. I leafed through the letters, one by one. Business messages from coworkers, newsletters, social media notifications, and among them, short messages from Theodore Rutledge. Each began with the word, darling. In each, there was an intimacy that only the two of them understood. Yesterday, you were especially beautiful in that blue dress. I can't wait to see you again. Remember that night at the Astoria? I closed my laptop and went to bed. The floorboards creaked upstairs. Evie was pacing around her office, back and forth, like a hunted animal in a cage. Sleep wouldn't come. I stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together the pieces of my life. At 1 a.m., I heard her coming down the stairs. I covered my eyes, pretending to be asleep. Evie lay next to me, trying not to make any noise. She smelled like her favorite night cream and something else. Maybe guilt? Good night, she whispered into the darkness. I didn't answer. We lay side by side, separated by a few centimeters of space and a whole chasm of unspoken words. Outside the window, the night rain sounded, and somewhere in the distance an ambulance siren wailed. Tomorrow we're going to the pool. We'll swim side by side like we always did. I'll watch her part the water with her strong arms, dive in, taking in air, smile at me across the lane. Chlorine. The smell of chlorinated water has always soothed me. Maybe that's why I'd agreed to go to the pool, even though every cell in my body resisted the idea of seeing Evie in her red swimsuit, now bringing to mind a very different thought. Who else had seen her in it? Who else had watched her gracefully walk up the stairs, water running down her shoulders? Will you take our favorite lanes? Evie emerged from the women's locker room, adjusting her rubber cap. Lanes 5 and 6 had been hours from the start, far enough away from the noisy groups of kids, but also not at the very wall where the pros usually practiced. Sure, I tried to smile. It came out crooked. In the water, everything seemed almost normal. We were swimming parallel, like we had hundreds of times before. I watched her honed strokes with the corner of my eye. Over the years, she'd gone from an insecure amateur to a fine swimmer. I wondered if she had also perfected the art of lying. After 30 minutes of swimming, Evie stopped at the edge of the board, pulled off her cap, and her red hair spread over her shoulders. I remembered how she'd once been self-conscious about the color, wanting to dye her hair brown. I'd talked her out of it. Now I wondered if I should have let her change back then. Maybe it would have kept her from making other, more serious changes. Oh, Evelyn, what a pleasant surprise! A woman's high-pitched voice cut through the damp air of the pool. Standing at the edge of the walkway was an elegant woman in an expensive tracksuit. I recognized her from pictures on the internet. Audrey Rutledge, Ted's wife. Audrey? I didn't know you came here. Evie's voice trembled. Barely noticeable, but I'd learned to notice details like that over the past few days. Oh, just getting started. Ted insisted. Says you need to keep in shape. Audrey smiled, showing perfect teeth. And this must be your husband? Brighton, right? I nodded, scooting closer. It was strange to see the wife of his wife's lover. It was even stranger to shake her outstretched hand, feeling the perfect manicure. Ted's told me so much about you. Said you worked in logistics? Used to work, I corrected. Recently got downsized. Audrey was like an expensive porcelain figurine, beautiful but impenetrable. Oh, I'm so sorry. You know, Ted was just saying he's looking for someone to join his company's transportation department. Maybe you should... I prefer larger companies, I replied. But thanks for the offer. Well, suit yourself. Audrey fixed her perfectly styled hair. How did she manage to keep it up in this humidity? By the way, Evelyn, are you coming to the fundraiser next Friday? Ted is really counting on your help with the organization. I felt Evie tense up next to me. It was as if the water between us had thickened, gotten colder. Of course, I promised. Her voice sounded calm. Too calm. Brighton's coming too. This was news to me. In fact, like so much else lately. Wonderful, Audrey brightened. Ted will be so excited. Well, I won't get in your way. Have a nice swim. She strode away, clacking her stilettos on the tile. Who wears heels to the pool? You didn't mention the evening, I remarked as Audrey disappeared from view. I, forgot. Evie didn't look at me. There's going to be a fundraiser for the new school library. It's not a big deal. And Ted Rutledge is counting on your help. He's counting on all the teachers to help. She pushed off the curb. A couple more laps? I watched her swim, every movement honed to perfection. I'd once been proud of that, her pursuit of perfection in everything. Now I wondered what else had she perfected. Lying? At home, Evie went straight into the shower. I could hear the water running upstairs, her humming something. I opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of beer. There was still a picture of us from last year's vacation hanging on the door, us on the beach, happy, tanned. I remembered that day, how the sun had gotten tangled in her hair, how she'd laughed when a wave knocked us over, how she'd kissed me, salty from the seawater. My phone vibrated. A message from Meredith, our mutual friend. Long time no see. How about dinner this weekend? Meredith worked as a school counselor where Evie taught. They were close, so close that I sometimes joked about my jealousy. Now I wondered, did she know? Had she been covering for her friend all these months? Of course, I answered. On Saturday? Just us. The answer came almost immediately. Okay, 7? I agreed and deleted the correspondence. For the first time in my life, I was hiding something from Evie. The irony of the situation didn't escape me. Evie came downstairs a half hour later, wearing housepants and the very t-shirt with the Continental Transportation logo on it. She smelled like lavender shampoo. I'll make dinner, she said, pulling out a pot. Want some pasta? I nodded, watching her move around the kitchen. Every gesture she made was familiar. Here she was pulling spices from the top shelf, standing on tiptoe. Here she poured salt into the boiling water, a pinch for every year of love, as her grandmother used to say. How many pinches would she pour today? You know, she said suddenly without turning around, maybe you should think about Audrey's offer, about working at Ted's. The paste in her hands dropped into the water with a loud splash. Really? And how do you envision that? She froze, still standing with her back to me, her shoulders tensed under the fabric of her t-shirt. It's a good company, stable, and jobs aren't easy to find right now. I just want to help. And you'd be comfortable seeing your husband's boss every day at school? Sure. I finished my beer in one gulp. You know, I'm not hungry. I'll work in the garage. The garage was cool. My model truck stood there, a whole collection of them from my years at Continental. I took one, a vintage Peterbilt, a gift from Pierce. Red cab, chrome parts, just like the real thing in miniature. I wonder if Ted Rutledge has hobbies. Does he collect anything besides other people's wives? The phone vibrated again, this time a message from Evie. Dinner's ready, come down? I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my browser and typed in Ted Rutledge's name. Photos, articles, interviews, successful businessman, model family man, philanthropist, charity fundraisers, school events, business meetings. In each photo, impeccable suit, confident smile. In one of the photos, he was standing next to a group of teachers. Evie was there, slightly off to the side, but his hand was resting on the back of the chair she was sitting behind. A coincidence? Or a message only I could read? There was a quiet knock on the garage door. Brighton, please come upstairs, it's getting cold. Her voice sounded almost pleading. I turned off the phone and looked up. Through the frosted glass of the door, I could see her silhouette so familiar and so foreign at the same time. Coming, I replied, setting the model truck on the shelf. I'll just wash my hands. We'll have dinner, sitting across from each other at a table we bought together at a flea market 5 years ago. We'll talk about the weather, about work, about weekend plans. We'll play our parts in this play of everyday life. And in a week, We'll go to a fundraiser where I'll meet for the first time the man who reads my wife's letters and probably knows the taste of her kisses. The little restaurant off the main streets with shabby leather couches and old photographs on the walls was Meredith and I's secret place. We discovered it by accident 3 years ago when we were looking for shelter from a sudden downpour. Since then, we'd often meet here when Evie was working late. Now I realized that those delays could mean something else entirely. Meredith was already waiting for me at our usual table by the window. She was always early. Punctuality was second nature to her. Today she was wearing a navy blue dress, an unusual choice for a woman who favored jeans and loose sweaters. "You look great," I said, taking a seat across from her. "And you look lousy," she replied bluntly, scrutinizing my face. "What's going on, Brighton?" Instead of answering, I pulled out my phone and showed her the picture from the school event, the one where Ted Rutledge's hand was almost touching Evie's shoulder. "How long have you known?" Meredith went pale. Her fingers holding the menu visibly trembled. "What do you mean?" "Don't." I shook my head. "Just tell the truth. You're a psychologist. You know how important it is not to keep things bottled up." The waiter brought water. Meredith took a sip, leaving a trail of dark red lipstick on the glass. Evie had once worn the same shade. "I can't betray my friend's trust," she finally said. "Can you betray my trust?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. In the dim light of the restaurant lamps, her face seemed drained, aged. "It's complicated, Brighton. It's complicated." "What's complicated about cheating?" "Shh," she looked around. "Look, I've tried talking to her many times. But you know Evie, when she's made up her mind about something?" "When?" I interrupted. "When did it start?" Meredith closed her eyes, as if gathering her thoughts, or with her strength. "About 8 months ago. At that charity auction, remember? You couldn't go, there was an important client meeting," I remembered. Evie had come back at midnight, unusually animated. Said they'd raised a record amount of money for the school's new lab. And the next day, she'd bought that blue silk scarf she'd previously thought too expensive. He was there all night next to her," Meredith continued. "Danced with her, laughed at her jokes. Audrey left early, migraine or something, and then—" "That's enough." I turned away to the window. "I don't need the details." The waiter returned to take the order. I mechanically named the first dish on the menu without reading the name. Meredith ordered only a salad. "What are you going to do?" she asked when we were alone again. "What would you recommend, professionally?" She grinned sadly. "Professionally, I'd advise an honest conversation. But we both know that doesn't always work." "They're meeting at the Astoria," I said in a casual tone, like I was discussing the weather. "I've seen the letters." "Brighton. You know what the funny thing is? I took her there for our 5th anniversary, remember? You helped me pick out the restaurant, said it was the most romantic place in town." Meredith reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you." I pulled away. Her touch suddenly felt scalding. "You should have, but you didn't. I hoped it would pass, that she'd come to her senses. Evie loves you, she really does. It's just not just me, is it?" The food arrived. I looked at the plate in front of me, some kind of steak with a side of vegetables. Evie used to cook the same one, only better. Used to cook it. "She's changed since that auction," Meredith said quietly. "Became more distant. All she talked about at work was new education programs, how important it was to get sponsors. And Ted, he has a way of charming people, including my wife. He's dangerous, Brighton," she suddenly said seriously. "I've seen how he acts. First the compliments, then the gifts, small, inconspicuous ones. Professional advice, friendly encouragement. And then my wife starts meeting him at the Astoria." Meredith wrinkled her nose. "I'm sorry. I really tried." "I know." I smiled for the first time all evening. Crookedly, but sincerely. "You're a good friend, Mir. Just caught between two fires. There's a fundraiser next week." She pushed aside the untouched salad. "He'll be there. And Evi, and I'll be there too," I finished for her, "to finally meet the man who ruined my marriage. Brighton, Promise me you won't do anything stupid. I looked out the window again. A couple was walking down the street, holding hands. The woman was saying something, gesturing vigorously, the man listening with a smile. They looked happy, carefree. You know, I said, not taking my eyes off the window, when I met Evie, she always left the last piece of dessert for me. Said the good stuff should be saved for last. I wonder if she does the same with him. Stop it, Meredith grumbled. You're hurting yourself. I know, I finally looked at her. But what else can I do? The rest of dinner passed in silence. We both pretended to eat, even though the food seemed tasteless. When the bill came, I insisted on paying. Call me, Meredith said at the exit. Anytime, forgive me. I nodded and headed for the car. The sky had clouded over the rain was coming. Evie always said she loved thunderstorms. We often sat on the porch, wrapped in plaid, and counted the seconds between the flash of lightning and the thunder. I wonder who she'll be counting them with now. I got home late. The bedroom light was off. Evie was already asleep. I went quietly up to my office, turned on my computer. The letters were still there, dozens of them, full of secret signs and hidden meanings. She never deleted them. Important meeting tomorrow at 3. I can't wait. The file you asked for is in the mail. Thank you for a wonderful evening discussing the curriculum. Curriculum, meetings, files. How easy it is to disguise cheating as work correspondence. How easy it is to hide passion behind a business tone. My phone vibrated a message from Evie. Where are you? I'm worried. I looked at the time. Almost midnight. She used to always wait for me if I was late. Now she pretends to be worried. At a friend's, I replied briefly. Don't wait up. Turning off my phone, I leaned back in my chair. Outside the window, it was finally starting to rain. Large drops drummed on the glass, creating a bizarre rhythm. Somewhere in the house, the door creaked open. Evie came out of the bedroom. I heard her footsteps down the hallway, quiet, cautious. She stopped at the door to my study. I held my breath, expecting a knock. But there was none. A moment later, the footsteps were gone. She went back to her bedroom, leaving me alone with the letters and the memories. In the morning, for the first time in 8 years of marriage, I didn't kiss Evie before I left. I pretended I was in a big hurry to get to a job interview. She was standing at the kitchen counter, holding a coffee cup, her favorite, inscribed, "To the best teacher," a gift from last year's graduating class. I wondered if any of those kids had any idea that their adored Mrs. Callahan led a double life. Good luck, she said after me. Her voice sounded unsure, like she didn't know how to act now either. Will you call me after? I mumbled something vague and walked out without turning around. Her gardening tools were on the veranda. She'd been working on her roses yesterday. It had once been an activity we'd done together. I dug the holes, she planted the bushes, then we watered them together and dreamed of how beautiful they would be in a year. Now her garden was blooming without my help. In the car, I turned on the radio, a classical music CD. Evie always said it helped her focus. I abruptly pulled it out and threw it in the back seat. Instead, I turned on the news station. Anything to drown out my thoughts. The first interview was at 10 at Midwest Logistics. I arrived half an hour early and just sat in the car, watching people enter the building. Men in suits, women in heels, all in a hurry, all engrossed in their phones. I wonder how many of them are leading double lives too. Unfortunately, Mr. Callahan, we already have a candidate for this position, the HR manager said after 40 minutes of conversation. But we'll keep your resume on file. I nodded, shook my hand, and walked out. It was the third interview in a week, and the same answer everywhere. Unthinkable bad luck for someone with my experience. At the cafe across the street, I ordered a coffee. Black, no sugar. I used to drink it with milk and 2 spoonfuls of sugar. Now I wanted something more bitter. Excuse me. The waitress touched my shoulder. Your phone's ringing. I didn't even notice. Evie's name popped up on the screen. I dropped the call and muted it. A minute later, a message came through. How'd it go? I'll make your favorite dinner. Her favorite dinner, steak with rosemary and baked potatoes. Funny how she always said your favorite, even though she was the one who loved that dish. I wonder if she cooks for him too. Lingering, I wrote back. The next interview was at 2. I arrived early, parked. The security guard at the entrance asked for ID, checked the list. "I'm sorry, Mr. Callahan, but your appointment has been canceled. Didn't you get a call back?" "No." I looked at my phone. "No missed calls." "That's odd." "That's too bad. Maybe we should contact the HR department." I nodded and walked outside. The sun was blinding my eyes. Or maybe it was the unsolicited tears. I couldn't tell. I found a vacant bench in the park across the street and sat down, looking at the children playing. A little girl with red hair like Evie's was swinging on a swing. Her father stood nearby, pushing the swing higher and higher. We wanted children. We talked about it often in the early years of our marriage. Evie even started collecting children's books, a whole shelf in our library. Then that private school job came along, and somehow the baby talk stopped on its own. Now I understood why. The phone vibrated again. A message from Meredith. "How are you?" "Fine," I lied. "Evie asked about you today. She seemed worried." "Really?" "Brighton. Maybe we should talk to her." I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my browser and started looking at Ted Rutledge's profile. Successful businessman, philanthropist, model family man, photos from charity events, business meetings, family outings. Everywhere that confident smile, expensive suits, beautiful wife by his side, and not a single hint that he's destroying other people's families. I got home late at night. The house smelled of roast meat and rosemary. There were candles on the kitchen table. She really had cooked my favorite dinner. "Brighton." Evie looked out of the kitchen. She was wearing an apron with funny kittens on it, my present last Christmas. I was starting to get worried. "Really?" I walked past her into the living room. "You didn't have to wait." "But I wanted to." "How did the interview go?" "It didn't. Canceled at the last minute." She frowned. "That's odd. Maybe I should call and clarify. Maybe you should admit something's wrong." I turned to her abruptly. 3 rejections in a week, 1 canceled interview. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Evie went pale. "What do you mean?" "Nothing." I sank tiredly into the chair. "Just thinking out loud." She stood in the doorway for another minute, rubbing the ties of her apron. "Dinner's ready. Will you eat with me?" I shook my head. "Not hungry." "You're hardly eating these days." "Lost my appetite. Happens when you lose your job. Or something else." She flinched at the last words. I watched her nervously fix a strand of hair, such a familiar gesture. I used to find it endearing. Now every movement she made caused a muffled pain somewhere under my ribs. "I'm worried about you," she said quietly. "You shouldn't be. You probably have more important things to worry about." "What does that mean?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing." She stood for a moment longer, as if waiting for something. Then she quietly walked away to the kitchen. I could hear her rattling dishes, water pouring, something sizzling in the pan, the usual sounds of an ordinary evening, only there was nothing ordinary anymore. Going upstairs, I walked into our bedroom. On her nightstand was a book, some kind of contemporary novel. I didn't know the author. The bookmark was an old photograph of us on the beach, young, happy. I remembered that day. In the bathroom, I stood under the shower for a long time, letting the hot water wash away the tension of the day. There was her lavender-scented shampoo on the shelf, her toothbrush in the cup next to mine, the hand cream she used before bed. All these little details of life together that used to seem so natural. When I came out, the nightlight was on in the bedroom. Evie was sitting on the bed with her arms wrapped around her knees. "Talk to me," she asked. "Please." I looked at her, so beautiful in the soft light of the lamp, so native and so foreign at the same time. "What do you want to talk about, Evie? About work? About the weather? About the fundraiser next week?" "About us." Her voice trembled. "What's going on with us?" I grinned bitterly. "Do you really want to know?" She remained silent. A car drove by outside the window, illuminating the room with its headlights for a second. In that light, I saw tears in her eyes. "Good night, Evie," I said, and walked out of the bedroom. In the guest room, which had become my sanctuary for the past few days, I lay on the bed without turning on the light. In the darkness, I could hear her crying quietly behind the wall. Before, I would have been there by now, hugging her, comforting her. Now her tears caused only muffled pain and a desire to get as far away as possible. The phone vibrated softly. A message from an unknown number. "Check your mail, Mr. Callahan. I think you might be interested." I opened the mail. The new letter contained only one line. "Your termination was no accident." I reread the letter over and over until the lines began to blur in front of my eyes. "Your termination was no accident." 7 words that turned my world completely upside down. Scraps of memories swirled in my head. Pierce's strange looks in the last weeks before I was fired. Suddenly canceled meetings. Whispered conversations in the hallways. I never got to sleep. I got up early, when it was just starting to get light outside the window. The house was silent. Evie usually woke up at 7 to check her homework before class. I quietly walked down to the kitchen, machine setting the coffee down. The jar of coffee beans was almost empty. I used to always keep track of it, buying a new one as soon as the old one started to run out. Now it seemed so insignificant. There was still a shopping list on the refrigerator, written in her neat handwriting. Milk, bread, vegetables, ordinary things for an ordinary family. Only we hadn't been an ordinary family for a long time. I tore the sheet off and crumpled it up. At 7:30, the shower rumbled upstairs. I hurriedly finished my cooled coffee and left the house. The garage was cool and smelled of car oil, a familiar, soothing odor. I ran my hand over the hood of my old Honda. I should have washed it. But what was the point now? My phone vibrated. A message from Jim, my former coworker. "Got to talk. Meet me?" We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near the Continental Transportation office. Jim was already waiting for me, tapping his fingers nervously on the table. In front of him was a cup of untouched coffee and an almost empty ashtray. He always smoked a lot when he was nervous. "You look lousy," he said in lieu of a greeting. "You're not in the best shape either." I sat down across from him. "What's wrong?" Jim looked around, as if afraid we might be overheard. "Look, what happened to you? It's not right." "What's what?" "Your layoff." "It wasn't a layoff. I mean, technically yes, but in reality..." He fell silent, smoking again. His hands trembled slightly. "Go on." My voice sounded strangely calm. "There was a meeting, a week before you were fired. Rutledge Development was going to be a major client of ours, a contract worth millions, but there was one condition." "My firing?" Jim nodded. "Pierce resisted, true, but when there's that kind of money at stake..." I looked out the window of the coffee shop. People were walking by, hurrying to work, talking on the phone, living their normal lives. My life was ordinary too until one man decided to ruin it. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because it's wrong." Jim put out his cigarette. "And because I saw your wife with him yesterday, at the Astoria." Something shivered inside. It was one thing to read the letters, to suspect, to guess. It was quite another to hear confirmation from a stranger. They weren't hiding much," Jim continued, avoiding looking me in the eye. "Sat in the far corner, but look, I'm really sorry." I stood up, pulling out my wallet. "Thanks for telling me." "Wait." He grabbed my sleeve. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing." I put the coffee money on the table. "Absolutely nothing." Walking out of the coffee shop, I just walked down the streets, not making out the road. Past office buildings, past stores, past schools and playgrounds. At one point, I found myself at the same pool where Evie and I used to swim. It was the same inside the same chlorine smell, the same blue lanes, the same hum of voices echoing off the tiled walls. The phone vibrated. A message from Evie. "Where are you? I'm worried." Worried. Of course she was. Probably as worried as she'd been yesterday, sitting with him in Astoria. "It's okay," I texted. "Don't expect me for dinner." The next message came from Meredith. "Evie called. She's crying." I turned my phone off, walked into the locker room, opened my old locker, number 37, Evie and I's lucky number. Inside was still my old swimming goggles and a towel. Something rustled in the pocket of the towel, an old photograph. Evie and I by the pool, both wet and happy. On the back in her handwriting, "Thank you for teaching me not to be afraid of the deep." The deep, that's where I was now, at the bottom, where you can't see the surface, where it's hard to breathe, where there's pressure from all sides. Only now there was no one to pull me out. I got home late at night. The lights were on in the house, all the windows like beacons in the darkness. Evie was waiting for me on the veranda, wrapped in a plaid, the same one we like to sit in during thunderstorms. "Brighton," she stood up as I climbed the steps. "I've been freaking out. Why haven't you been answering your phone?" I looked at her, pale, with reddened eyes. She was wearing my old shirt, the one I'd proposed to her in. She'd kept it all these years, sometimes wore it home. It used to touch me. "Tired," I said as I walked by. "I'm going to go to bed." "Wait," she grabbed my hand. "Please, let's talk." "About what? About how your day went? Or about how you spent last night at Astoria?" She recoiled as if I'd hit her. Her hand, still holding mine, fell limply. Who told you? Does it matter?" The house was warm and smelled of cinnamon. She was baking. Always baking when she was nervous. There was a fresh apple pie on the kitchen table, my favorite. Used to be a favorite. "Brighton, I can explain." "You don't have to." I sank tiredly onto the couch. "Really, you shouldn't. But you have to understand." "Understand what exactly? That you're dating the man who ruined my career? Or that you've been lying to me for months?" She froze. "What are you talking about? What career?" "Never mind," I stood up. "Totally irrelevant. Totally." As I walked up the stairs, I could hear her crying downstairs. Before, every tear she cried had been like a knife in my heart. Now all I felt was tiredness, endless, deafening fatigue. In the guest room, I lay down without undressing. Something fell behind the wall. She must have dropped something in the kitchen. Then I heard her footsteps on the stairs, a quiet knock on the door. "Good night, Brighton." Her voice was barely audible. "I love you." I didn't answer, just lay there in the dark, listening to her leave. The creak of the floorboards in the hallway, the bedroom door slamming, the rain starting to fall outside the window. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. I'd forgotten to turn it off. A message from an unknown number. "Tomorrow, 10 in the morning, Astoria parking lot. I'll tell you everything." The Astoria looked very different in the morning light. Not as grand as it had the night Evie and I had celebrated our 5th anniversary here. I parked in the far corner of the parking lot, turned off the engine, and waited. On the passenger seat lay the crumpled program from that night. I'd found it yesterday while sorting through papers in the garage. 5 years ago, we were sitting at a table by the window, drinking champagne, and Evie was talking about her plans to become the best teacher in town. A knock on the window made me flinch. Audrey Rutledge was standing by the car, bundled up in an elegant beige coat. She looked tired despite her flawless makeup. "May I?" She nodded to the passenger seat. I tucked the program into the glove compartment and unlocked the door. Audrey smelled like expensive perfume and coffee. "Thank you for coming," she spoke softly, as if she was afraid we might be overheard even here. "There's something I have to tell you. About your husband and my wife. About what kind of man Ted Rutledge really is." She pulled an envelope out of her purse and held it out to me. "Here are copies of letters, not just to your wife. To others, too." "Others? You're not the first husband whose family he destroyed," Audrey grinned bitterly. "Nor the first man whose career he destroyed for his passion." I opened the envelope. Letters, dozens of letters, to different women, at different times. The same phrases, the same promises. "You're special. You're the only one who understands me. We were made for each other." "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I'm tired." Her voice trembled. "Tired of watching him ruin lives. Every time he falls in love, obsessively, madly. Every time he believes this woman is the one. And every time... What happens every time? He gets what he wants, at any cost. Even if it takes destroying someone's career, someone's marriage." I squeezed the steering wheel. "He's in love with my wife?" Audrey nodded. "At that charity auction. Said he'd never met a woman like her. Smart, talented, understanding." I've heard that 4 times in our marriage. And that's why he got me fired? He saw you as an obstacle, said that if you lost your job, if you were vulnerable, Evelyn would see the difference between you and him. Successful, confident, able to give her everything. I remembered the last few months, how Evie had comforted me after my layoff, how she cooked my favorite meals, how she tried to be supportive. And in the meantime, he's going to marry her, Audrey said quietly. Already consulted with lawyers about the divorce. With me. It became hard to breathe in the car. I rolled down the window, letting in the cold morning air. What about Evie? Does she know about his plans? I don't think so. He never reveals all his cards at once. First, he creates the illusion of a special relationship. Then what? Then he gets what he wants. Then he loses interest. I stared at the front of the Astoria, the stately building where my wife now met the man determined to appropriate her for himself like a prized possession. Why now? I asked. Why did you decide to tell me now? Audrey pulled out her phone, showed a picture of a young woman with a baby. This is Sarah, Ted's third. Ted's infatuation. After he got his way and lost interest, she had a nervous breakdown. Her husband took the baby. I can't keep quiet anymore. She put the phone away and pulled out another envelope. Here are documents on exactly how he got you fired. Conditional contract, letters to the board of directors, everything you need to sue. Why do I need this? Because sometimes you have to fight, not for revenge, but for the ones you love. I picked up the envelope. It seemed incredibly heavy. What about you? Audrey smiled sadly. I've already filed for divorce. Leaving for Europe next week can't be a part of this madness. She opened the door, but before she walked out, she turned around. You know what the worst part is? He truly believes he's in love. He believes it every time. And every time he's willing to ruin someone else's life for that illusion. I sat in the car long after she left, reading documents, letters, evidence of how methodically one man had methodically destroyed my life because of his obsession. My phone vibrated a message from Evie. Can we talk, please? I looked at the time, almost noon. She was supposed to be at school, teaching a class, but she was texting me instead. I'm home, I replied. Come over. She arrived 20 minutes later, disheveled, no makeup, wearing the very blue dress that Ted had written about that made her especially beautiful. I'll tell you everything, she said, standing in the doorway of our living room. Everything you want to know. I silently handed her the letters from the first envelope. She read them, and I could see the expression on her face change. Bewilderment, shock, pain. I didn't know. Her voice trembled. He said I was special, that he'd never felt this way before. And this, I handed her a second envelope, is the paperwork on how your special Ted got me fired, to make me look like a loser in your eyes. She went pale. No, he couldn't. He could, and he did. And now he's going to divorce Audrey and marry you. Did you know that? Evie sank down on the couch as if her legs had stopped holding her up. Brighton, I swear I didn't know anything about you being fired, and about the wedding. All he said was that we were made for each other, that we understood each other like no one else. I looked at her, the woman I loved more than life, who had betrayed me, who had been used, as others had been used before her. You know what the worst part is? I said. Not the cheating, not the lies. It's that you let him destroy what we've spent years building, our life, our trust, our... Brighton, go away. I stood up. Just go. Please, let's talk. About what? About how you met him at the hotel where we celebrated our anniversary? About how he was planning to ruin my career and you didn't notice? Or about how you were going to be the 5th Mrs. Rutledge? She cried quietly, hopelessly. Her tears had once made my heart break, but not now. I love you, she whispered. I always have. You know what's funny? I grinned bitterly. I do too, even now. She looked up at me with tearful eyes. Then maybe... No, I shook my head. Sometimes love isn't enough. The front door closed quietly behind her. I stood at the window, watching her walk to the car, hunched over, small, not at all like the confident woman she'd become around Ted Rutledge. The house was quiet, just the ticking of the clock on the wall, a wedding present from her parents. I went into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Our picture from the beach was still hanging on the door. I took it down, tore it into little pieces. My phone vibrated, a message from Meredith. "Evie just called. She's hysterical. What happened?" I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the mail and started writing a statement to the court. Audrey was right. Sometimes you have to fight. The next 3 days passed like a blur. I mechanically gathered documents for court, answered my lawyer's calls, tried to eat and sleep. The house seemed incredibly empty without Evie. Her things were still here, the neatly stacked stack of books on the bedside table, her favorite mug in the dish drainer, the lavender-scented shampoo in the bathroom. Little reminders of a past life. She tried calling. Every evening at 9 sharp, the time we usually had tea on the veranda, discussing the day before. I didn't answer. What can you say to someone who was the center of your universe, and at the same time the cause of its destruction? On Wednesday, I went to the swimming pool for the first time in 2 weeks. Not our regular one, but another one on the other side of town. I swam until my muscles burned and my eyes darkened with fatigue. In the locker room, he caught his reflection in the mirror, a shrunken face, gray hair on his temples that hadn't been there before. "You don't look so good," came a voice from behind me. I turned around. Pierce Whitaker was standing in the locker room doorway, wearing a business suit out of place among the damp tile and chlorine smell. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "We need to talk." We got into his car, a black Lexus as solid and personable as its owner. Pierce was silent, twirling a key fob with the company logo on it. "I got a subpoena," he finally said. "As a witness." "And what are you going to say?" "The truth." He looked at me. "The whole truth about how Rutledge manipulated the board, how he threatened to revoke all contracts if we didn't fire you, how I succumbed to that pressure." I looked at the man who had been my boss for 12 years, who came to my birthday parties, gave me model trucks, praised my work, and who had betrayed me for a contract. "Why now?" "Because it's the right thing to do." He pulled a folder from the glove compartment. "Here are all the emails, all the documents, including the ones where he explicitly demands your termination. I've kept copies." Why? Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he knew the truth would come out someday. I picked up the folder. Inside were emails, memos, minutes of meetings, documentation of how methodically one man had methodically destroyed my career for the sake of his obsession. "You know," Pierce said, looking straight ahead, "I've been married too, twice, and both times my wives left me for others. Maybe that's why I kept my mouth shut back then. Saw the way Rutledge looks at your Evie at corporate parties, the way she thought I'd rather have it that way than later." "Then what?" "Than seeing her go off on her own." I stepped out of his car, clutching my file folder. The sky was frowning. Rain was coming down. Just like the day I first read Ted's letters. At home, I discovered that Evie's roses had begun to wilt. She had always tended them with a special tenderness, talking to each bush as if it were a living thing. Now they were dying without her care, as everything in the house was dying. The phone rang, Meredith's number. "Hi." Her voice sounded worried. "Are you home?" "Yeah, what's wrong?" "Evie, she's in the hospital." Something shivered inside. "What?" "A nervous breakdown. She came to school, made a scene with Ted right in the middle of the hallway, yelling something about cheating, about other women. Then she just fainted." I sat down right on the veranda steps. Raindrops fell on the papers in my hands, blurring the ink. "She's going to be okay," Meredith continued. "The doctors say severe nervous exhaustion. She needs rest and—" "What hospital?" "Memorial, but Brighton." I was already walking to my car, dialing my lawyer's number as I went. "Sending you more documents." "From your former boss, and yes, reschedule the lawsuit. To next week." The hospital smelled like antiseptic and coffee from a vending machine. The nurse on duty took a long look at my paperwork. "Are you a husband?" "Yes, for now." The room was small and bright. Evie lay on the bed, so pale she seemed almost transparent. The IV was counting down the seconds. "Hi," she said quietly, without opening her eyes. "I knew you'd come." I sat down in the chair next to the bed. "How are you?" "Broken. Devastated. Destroyed," she grinned sadly. "Pick anyone." "Meredith said you were at school." "Yeah. Wanted to return all the presents to him. All those stupid trinkets he used to buy my attention. And then I saw him with the new physics teacher. He looked at her the same way he used to look at me. And said the same words." Her voice trembled. I reached out to take her hand but stopped halfway. "Your roses are withering," I said the first thing that came to mind. She smiled weakly. "I know, I saw from the window of your guest room. Came by to pick up some things when you weren't home." "You were home?" "Yes, a few times. Stood in our bedroom and couldn't believe I'd ruined everything. Looked at the pictures, touched your things. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come over without asking. It's still your house." "No." She shook her head. "I've lost the right to call it mine." Outside the window, the rain began to fall again. The drops drummed on the glass, the same rhythm as the drip over her bed. "What now?" she asked. "Now I sue. Against Ted. For wrongful termination." "And you're going to win." "What makes you so sure?" "Because you're more honest than he is." The nurse looked into the room. "Visiting hours are ending." I stood up. "I have to go." "Brighton." Evie caught my arm. "Thanks for coming." Her fingers were cold and trembling. I'd once warmed those hands with my breath, kissed every phalanx, promised never to let go. "Get well," I said, and walked out without looking back. In the hallway stood Ted Rutledge, impeccable suit, confident posture. Only his eyes betrayed anxiety. "Mr. Callahan," he began. "Don't," I held up my hand. "Just stay away from my wife." "You don't understand. I really love—" "No." I looked him in the eye. "You love the idea, the chase, the process of conquest. And when you get what you want, you start looking for a new goal. And I feel sorry for you. I really do." I left the hospital in the rain. I got in my car, but I didn't start the engine. Just sat there. My phone vibrated. A message from Meredith. "How is she?" "Broken, but she'll live." "And you?" I looked up at the hospital window where the light was on. Evie's silhouette was visible through the blinds, small, lonely. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I really don't know. The roses had died after all. I tried to save them. I watered them in the mornings, trimmed the dry leaves, even bought some special fertilizer at the garden center. But it's like they decided to die along with our marriage. The last bud fell this morning. I watched the red petals fall to the damp ground and thought about how some things just can't be saved, no matter how hard you try." Evie was released from the hospital 3 days later. I knew about it from Meredith. I didn't visit her again myself. It took one visit to realize that sometimes distance was the only cure, but fate seemed to have other plans. I ran into her at the supermarket, a banal place for a meeting that turned the last remnants of my world upside down. She was standing by the coffee shelf, looking at the very brand we always bought. She was wearing a new dress, navy blue, elegant, and new earrings. I'd never seen those on her before. "Hi," she said first. Her voice sounded more confident than it had in the hospital. "It's been a while." 2 weeks. I grabbed the first packet of coffee I could find without looking at the name. "How are you?" "Better. Much better." She was quiet. "Brighton, we need to talk." I glanced at my watch, a pointless gesture just to keep my hands busy with something. "About what?" "Why don't we have coffee? There's a cafe nearby." The cafe turned out to be small and almost empty. We sat by the window, a habit ingrained from years of eating breakfast together. Evie ordered a cinnamon latte. I ordered a black coffee. We'd always had the same drinks before. "I saw the court papers," she began. "Meredith showed me. You can really win this case. I know. I want you to know that I support you, no matter what happens next." "What do you mean next?" She twirled the cup in her hands without looking at me. "I'm staying with Ted." The words fell between us like stones. I felt my face go numb, a strange sensation, as if someone had injected anesthesia right into my heart. After everything you've learned? Yes. She finally looked up. I know it sounds crazy. I know he's manipulated, lied, used. But I love him, no matter what. What about the other women? His plans to marry you only to then… He's changed. She smiled weakly. Really changed. After that incident at school, we talked a lot. He's seeing a therapist, working on himself. I stared at the woman across from me, so similar on the outside to my Evie and so alien on the inside. You believe that after everything? I do, because I want to believe it. Because when I'm with him, everything feels right, even when it's wrong. What about me, our marriage, 8 years together? I loved you, Brighton, I really did. And part of me will always love you. But with Ted, it's different. Something inexplicable, irrational, destructive, I finished for her. Maybe. She ran her finger over the rim of the cup. But it's my choice. I looked out the window. There were people walking by, hurrying about their business. I wondered if any of them were sitting like this too, listening to their world crumble, not because of a lie or a betrayal, but because of a simple choice, monstrous in its simplicity. You know, I said without looking at her, I've always been proud of how strong you are, independent, smart, and now you're disappointed. No, now I just feel sorry for you. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Don't feel sorry for me. It's my choice, your path to self-destruction? Yeah, maybe. But you're right, it's your choice. I pulled an envelope out of my pocket. Divorce papers. You can sign it and send it to my lawyer. She took the envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly. So soon? Is there any point in procrastinating? Probably not. She opened her purse, took out a pen. An expensive, engraved one. I recognized Ted's handwriting on the metal casing. You'll sign it with the pen your lover gave you. Ironic. Brighton, please. I'm sorry, I didn't expect it to end like this. She signed it, quickly, decisively, as if she was afraid she'd change her mind. The handwriting she'd used for 8 years to sign our holiday cards together now put an end to our story. What are you going to do next? She asked, handing back the envelope. I'm going to sue, win the case, start over. And the house? Sell it or rent it out. I don't want to live among ghosts. She nodded. The roses. Dead. We left the cafe together. Our last walk together. Outside her car, new, expensive, clearly a gift from Ted. I watched as she got in, as she drove out of the parking lot. Her face flashed in the rearview mirror. She wasn't crying. Maybe the tears had run out. Maybe Ted had taught her how to hold them back. At home, the first thing I did was go to the garden. Dug up all the dead rose bushes, put them in garbage bags, earth under my fingernails, sweat on my forehead, thorns soiling my palms. The physical pain helped dull the mental pain. The phone rang as I was finishing up. Meredith. How are you? She asked without preamble. Fine. Uprooting roses. Evie called. Told me about your meeting. And what do you think? I think sometimes we can't save people from themselves. I looked at the empty flower beds, the black earth ready for new plantings, or for just staying empty. You know, I said, I always thought the scariest thing was betrayal. Turns out there's something scarier. What? Watching the person you love deliberately choose the path to self-destruction and not having the power to stop it. That evening, I sat in my study, sorting through old photographs. A car honked outside the house, an expensive one, judging by the sound. I went to the window. Ted Rutledge was helping Evie out of his Bentley, holding an umbrella over her. It was starting to rain. Had she forgotten something at home? Or did she just want to say goodbye? I didn't go downstairs, just sat in the darkness of the study, listening to the front door open. She still had her keys. The way she walked around the house, probably packing up the last of her things. Talking softly to Ted. His voice, confident, commanding, echoed through the empty rooms. Half an hour later, they were gone. I went downstairs. On the kitchen table were the keys and a note. I'm sorry for everything. Be happy, E. Her handwriting, so familiar and so foreign. One last message, one last dot. Outside the window, Ted was helping her into the car, caring, attentive, the perfect lover. She smiled at him, the same smile that had been meant for me before.